Today's Silicon Springbok podcast is with Llewellyn Watson, who's the co-founder and co-CEO of Structure It and DealX. He is really a founder's founder who has done it all from building a brand new business and product and going out and getting funding, but taking almost 2 decades to build this powerful business. And he, for me personally, has been a mentor and helped me along my path. My name is Dom Pitot. I'm the founder of JoyForge Labs, and the Silicon Springbok podcast is there to share the stories of founders and business builders who are building great businesses, not despite the challenges they face, but because of them. And these are the stories we want to tell. And this is Llewellyn's story. So I want to start today's discussion with dramatic moments. I'm going to age myself here a little bit, but I remember where I was when I heard the news about Diana passing away. I remember where I was when the 9/11 happened. Funny, Diana, but that was it. That was a huge thing.
Everyone did.
Yeah, and then 9/11, obviously, that was catastrophic and traumatic.
Yeah.
And then, for me, also the global financial crisis, which is going to be a little bit of the focus today. I had just come back to South Africa. I was in the foyer at Anglo American, about to start my next job with him. I'd been on a rotation in China and come back. And I'm sitting there in the foyer looking up at this stock ticker. And it's the end of September 2020, end of September 2008. And everything is red. And everything is minus 20, minus 30%. And, it's just, is the world going to collapse? What am I even doing? Am I even going to have a job in a week's time? Will anything still exist? There was just so much fear. I love that movie, The Big Short. I'm sure you've watched it. Maybe you haven't, but well worth watching. Probably watched it 10 times. There's the one guy's I think he's telling his mother, it's the end of capitalism. This panic that was there. And what happened after that, obviously, wasn't the end of the world. We didn't have the Great Depression, but certainly it was a very traumatic period, especially in the capital markets. And that was very much the space that you guys were playing in. So, well, where were you? What was that day, or what was the moment like that you remember most from that period?
So, for me, it wasn't really a moment. It was a series of events leading up to the crisis. Our business at the time was 2 years old, and that was our direct space. So every time we'd go and meet prospects or people, we're talking about what we're looking to do, everyone was saying the market's overheated. It's going to blow. We don't know how. We don't know when. And so as my business partner and I, Tim, we're both in the UK at the time. Tim is still in the UK. And we didn't want to hear the news. Obviously, maybe not obviously, but we'd spent 2 years building a product to service the exact instruments that were going to cause the financial crisis. And so it was a kind of the head in the ground, la, la, la moment. Maybe it'll go away. Maybe it won't happen. And then it very much did. And so, you talk about The Big Short. I certainly read it. I was living it. We're seeing these things happening. At the time, we worked for Deutsche Bank. The transactions were getting more and more wild, and more and more derivative-based, more and more synthetic. And we couldn't really understand the motivation behind some of the transactions as to why these things were even there. What was the business rationale? And then when it stopped, when the crisis happened, issuance of new instruments, which was billions year on year, suddenly just dried up overnight. So it directly affected our business model, which was our first product was to provide an administration platform for these instruments. And we relied on people coming into the market because issuance was so buoyant, and new shops were opening up weekly, and they needed some tech. There was either Excel or a full-based enterprise on-premise system. And so we to fill that gap with the first SaaS offering into that space at that time.
So maybe you can do a job as well as Jared Vennett or it was Ryan Gosling in that film. Tell us a little bit about, so what is the problem being solved, and what are they doing? So why does this need even exist in the market? And obviously, why did it collapse?
Yeah, so credit derivatives, which is what CDOs are, and that was really the start of collateralized debt obligations, initially started as a balance sheet transaction to create liquidity. So a bank typically was sitting on a bunch of assets that they'd lent out, that they lent money to people, and they had a whole lot of loans that were sitting on their balance sheet, and they couldn't do anything because the cash was all tied up. So a way to manage this was to get it off the balance sheet by transferring these assets into something called a special purpose vehicle, or an SPV. It's like a little company which buys the assets from it. It issues bonds to the market. Investors buy bonds. That cash comes in from the investors, it goes into the SPV, and it goes back to the bank. The investors then get their return on interest based on the loans, the interest that the loans or what are the asset classes generating gets paid to the bondholders. And then ultimately, when the loan's paid down, the bondholders are paid back. So what the bank has achieved in its initial form was, say it was $1 billion worth of loans sitting on its book. It sold $1 billion worth of loans off the book into an SPV, which has sold $1 billion worth of notes or bonds to the market. The market's paid them $1 billion. It's come back into the SPV, and then it's been paid back to the bank for the loans. So now there's $1 billion in liquidity that can do more stuff with. And will typically hold a piece of that transaction, but there was no due diligence done on the underlying lending. So people were self-assessing that they could afford to pay these mortgages and taking multiple mortgages out at one time, which was just financially impossible for them to pay back. But because there was no due diligence being done on the lending, borrowing was happening, getting off balance sheet, wrapping it up, selling on the debt to someone else, and the risk that goes with it, therefore, because the risk is transferred as well at the same time. And that was just on repeat. So when the housing crisis happened, that spiraled into the capital markets because of the risk had been transferred away from the bank.
Yeah, away from the bank into all of these different products now.
Into investors. These are pension
and as long
funds.
as everything's going up, all of these derivatives do well. Everyone's making huge amounts of money. Everything's happy. Yep. But when the market turned, the house of cards, comes crumbling down. But I think that the key thing people understand is liquidity is everything in the financial system. Creating liquidity is how these banks continue to be able to offer more products, do more business, make more profit. And then when there's a crisis like this, liquidity gets sucked out, everything collapses. But being in this business, it's like mortgage-backed securities are not by themselves bad. They are a good thing in general. But if you're over-leveraged and if you abuse it.
At risk in the mortgage in the housing crisis was the lack of due diligence around lending, which then got all wrapped up in securitization and sort of became an exponential flywheel because there's always someone who could take, investors who would buy into these. And these investors were at the very top of the high-rated, the AAAs, were often pension funds because it should be safe as houses.
So it was very traumatic, but it was also traumatic for you guys in the sense that you had. Tell me a little bit about that. So you had a comfy corporate job in London, working in the banks there. What made you decide to go off and do something else and not just carry on with a good life?
Yeah, so at the time, Tim and I, our role was to work for the analytics area of Deutsche Bank within their issuer services department. And we had built a Microsoft Access system that could handle these transactions, do the various reporting, do scenario trade testing, do cash flows, a whole bunch of different things that the transactions needed. Deutsche Bank would offer its services and continues to offer its services to its customers, which are collateral managers that organize and manage these CDOs. I'll use the brief term. There's not many instruments. So part of our job was to go and present how the analytics function worked at Deutsche Bank to these collateral managers as part of the roadshow and part of the pitch. And what we had noticed is that there were increasing amounts of smaller shops opening up. that were very curious as to how to run that transaction. What systems they were going to use. Excel is the default, but Excel is not good for anything which requires a database of information. It's great for a model, but as far as it goes. And so they kept asking, could we have that? And Deutsche Bank was in the business of doing proprietary software. And Tim and I heard this enough times to say, well, there's clearly an appetite here. There's a need here to provide some form of software. And we're not proper software developers. We are desktop jockeys at best. But we'd written something which was really useful. Here's an opportunity to create a business and leverage software as a service, which in the early 2000s, around 2005, we were coming up with a plan. That was really nascent. It was starting to take off. Cloud and, cloud, I think the term cloud probably existed, but people weren't aware of it. It was more virtual servers and things like that. So we thought, well, here's an opportunity. We'll take what we've written and we'll put it on. We'll get some guys who know how to develop, and we'll put it onto into a SaaS product, and we'll sell that. And it'll be an easy in, easy out, proper SaaS service, fixed licensing. So it's a simple understanding. We'll take care of the servers. It's all quite simple. So a collateral manager who wanted to run that transaction could just simply get a URL and log in and do their stuff, and there'll be that. And if they didn't like the service, they'd cancel it. So that was the plan. At the time I was, 2005 when we started thinking about 31. Tim was a couple of years ahead of me, and I didn't have any kids. My risk profile, my dad, I grew up in Zimbabwe. My dad was an entrepreneur. For me, it was, why not? What at the very worst, all falls in a heap, and I can go back to contracting to banks or something like that. It wasn't a challenging decision. My wife and I were not yet married either, so it was like, well, let's give it a go. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And so that's what led into that. And what we couldn't have foreseen when we started planning this was that the financial crisis would arrive. Not many people did, except for, I can't remember his name, the guy in The Big Short, who absolutely predicted
Nouriel
it.
Roubini, that guy, yeah, Dr. Doom.
And so we also never built a product before, and we made the very common mistake. We built like the most amazing thing. It could do everything, but it took 2.5 years to build. So by the time we were ready to press launch, there was no market. And so we fortunately managed to get 2 customers on. One of them still with us today, Santander. Been with us since the start. But there was clearly not going to be any new business. So 2008, I also had my first child, my oldest boy, Reese. 2009, I had my second child, Leo. And there were no new sales coming in, and bills were racking up. So to fund this, Tim and I consulted ourselves back to Deutsche Bank, and we used the excess. We used whatever money we could to pay for the standard operational costs and staff. So that's how we funded the business, with a view to then scaling and growing through license fees and revenue.
Now, you do make this sound like it was kind of okay. I'm sure, you had ambitions and plans and had told the wife, this is how it's going to work out, and promised investors or promised friends or others, that there's a lot that depends on this. And then, 2008 comes along. I do believe you probably then had to pivot, figure things out, work a way around it. What was so how did you survive that period? What was key?
It was extremely dark. We dropped to single income. So Louise, with having kids, she obviously stopped her job, and we had our boys in quick succession, 14 months apart. So, we made sure that all operational costs were paid for first. We didn't have many, so we had three developers at that time. Their costs were covered, and then Tim and I would take whatever was left, which wasn't a hell of a lot, and I started covering some spend with personal, with with personal loans or borrowing loans. So we didn't have any investors. So fortunately, we didn't have that to consider. It was just them and I sort of funding it through our consulting business or consulting back to the bank. We weren't quite sure what we were going to do. There's at least 2008, 2009 was really, really hard. Trying to just get through it. The whole world was feeling that, and it was we were doubly feeling it because that was our direct space, and we'd invested a lot of time, effort, emotion, and love into what we had built, and it now had seemingly no future. So, as the sort of green shoots started to come out in 2010 thereabouts, we could start to see a couple of opportunities come through, and the two opportunities that really we sort of focused on was one within our product space. The product we built was an administrative tool, but we saw an opportunity to turn it around into a transparency tool. So people who had invested in these transactions, we would organize and would clean and would find all the data, and because the data did exist, but it was just wrapped up in PDFs and there was no centralized source. So for investors on large portfolios, it was really hard to understand what was going on unless they had a massive team of analysts who were scouring the internet for these different reports and then cleaning them up and giving them information. So we performed that role with a data partner of finding all these reports, getting all the data out, and loading it directly into our transparency tool, previously administrative tool, and giving investors in these transactions the ability to see into their underlying assets and make more informed decisions on what they needed to do. So previously, the old business model, the administrative tool, whoever was managing the transaction would maintain and load all their data. This time we took a step further back and looked at the market. We'd get all the market information on the transactions, and the pivot was then to sell it to investors who invested in these assets or bonds and needed to understand what was going on in the underlying assets. So that was number one. And then number two was, as a result of the financial crisis and the lack of control that was around at that time, it was pretty fast and it was pretty furious. Deals being done, decisions being made. A lot of desktop products like my friend Excel and Access were being used. There was a realization that you can't run large businesses on Excel and Access, and I'm being reasonably facetious here because there were other systems, but it was being used too commonly. So there was the desire to build better tech to make, organize and manage workflows, information, whatever it may be, to get visibility and make better decisions. So it's almost the same parallel in the pivot, but one was to take our product and turn it into something else, and the other was to help these people and these institutions who needed to now invest in their technology and build stuff so they could make better decisions. So that was into consulting.
So you guys survived. Amazing. And you managed to find things that customers actually wanted. Now the next problems come, which is, okay, the business actually grows. Now it's not just you and Tim. Tell me a little about the scaling challenges and what are the next few years like, for you as the founder?
Yep. So what sort of predates the scale is having had two kids and being through some very dark times in the UK and being African at heart. Both my wife and I wanted to get back to where we came from. We both realized we wouldn't be particularly good parents in the UK. You've got to actually work quite hard. You can't just open the door and chuck them in the garden and say, don't come back. You actually have to take them out and wrap them up and a whole bunch of stuff. So Louise and I wanted to get back to Africa. And in 2011, we were able to do that. The reasons for that were really, we sold that product to Thomson Reuters. So that brought in a whole bit of, a reasonable amount of capital, which from a personal perspective helped me to pay back some debts, float a couple of other things, but give us more financial freedom. So to allow us, Louise and I, to move back to South Africa. And at the same time, one of the guys that we started with, a guy called Matt, also said, I'd like to go somewhere else. So he went off to New Zealand. So at one point, with there were only 5 of us in the company, we were split up in 3 different regions, being New Zealand, South Africa and the UK.
And
And
let's
we,
be
we're
clear,
running there with
this is long before remote work, like we're
long
used to
before
today,
remote.
was the
Absolutely.
norm, right? This was very, very unusual
Absolutely.
at the time.
Absolutely. So, we've always been very early adopters of collaboration tools. So, when Zoom came out, for example, one of the very, very early adopter, but we've managed, Skype also at the time. You could have Skype calls, you could do Skype chat. We just made a plan, and we went in there with open eyes. It was like, if this doesn't work, it doesn't work. Let's just, if the horse is dead, let's not flog it. But we managed to make a plan. We made the time zones work for a very, very, very small business as we were back then. And what I hadn't known coming into South Africa is, firstly, on the sort of directions that we'd found where we were going to go with the business, and also what South Africa would offer. I had no idea if there's internet, like reasonable internet. I literally had no idea. And back in 2011, it wasn't amazing. If you think of the quality of video calls we have now, that really was pretty bad back then. But to my delight, what I found was just really the talent that we have in South Africa is quite phenomenal. We have such educated people, we have such driven people, we have such smart people, we have people who have different perspectives, and you combine it all together, and it really is, it adds that's one of the sort of catalysts for the growth of our business, is that with the world reopening up in the early 2010s, 2015, opportunities were coming and we could see them, because Tim stayed in the UK, so he was closer to what was happening in the markets. In South Africa, we have a very, very small, we don't service South Africa at all. It's just the market's too small to be interested in things that we could offer. It needs volume and it needs size. So the US is our primary base. So Tim could see these opportunities coming through, and now that I was living in South Africa and I could see the amazing talent that we have here, you put the two together and we can now start to attack these opportunities a little more aggressively, and very importantly, economically competitively, because previously we were hiring out of the UK, which is multiple times the cost of doing it from South Africa. So as we were going through, started to build that, and as a blend of consulting and product, those are our two paths that we had chosen. Consulting, paying for the product, as we look for market adoption. We got to about 2017, and I think at that time, and by that stage, Mauritius had also come on as a region. We have a lot of data and sort of based over there. We had New Zealand, we had Joburg, we had Cape Town here at the UK, and our market was the US. So it was a lot of regions and time zones happening at that time. We also had a guy randomly in Thailand. And we got to about 2017. I think there were about 70 plus. There were about people across the business.
Amazing.
And I thought I was out of my depth. I knew I was out of my depth. I didn't really know how to take the business to another level, having had no training in it whatsoever. In my previous jobs, I was always a contractor, so I never ran teams. I didn't really had no organizational training whatsoever. And so in order to scale, I knew I needed help. And so I'd heard of a couple of guys who could recommend a coach, and Andrew Aitken from Grow Coaching has been absolutely foundational in our scaling phase, in our growth phase. So taking on a coach who could really be objective, but also give me the tools that we needed to grow the business to where we are now. We've got about across the two businesses, and we've got 6 locations. It's about 175 people.
So you got loads more employees. You have something that's working. In hindsight now, or so give me an idea of what was it like a moment in the 2017, something. We've all made our mistakes as founders,
Yep.
and done some damage. Even if you've got business coaches around and so forth, just like you say, being in the weeds and the pressure. Is there something you learned from that time that came from a particular point that you now would do differently?
So I would not do some things differently, in that because I was doing at one point every function in the business, from HR to working at the outsourced accounting. I was doing the bookkeeping. I was issuing all the invoices. I was running multiple projects. I was being a business analyst. I was doing a QA as well. It gave me a very thorough and deep understanding of all the business functions. If I had to go back and change things, I would have stopped doing that earlier, because it led to like a really strong, really bad mental health problems. In that I probably was burnt out. I don't know. I mean, but at the time, I had no one to speak to. It was just me trying to figure this out. Whereas, thankfully in the world today, mental health is far more weight is placed on it, and it's certainly impacted my experience. Has certainly impacted our business, and the emphasis we place on well-being is one of our core values, and we support it through multiple touch points, and we're open about it. I'm very open about the challenges that I faced, all which manifested itself in very physical means. So I'd get nervous tics, I'd get visual migraines, I'd eczema, couldn't sleep properly, my heart pressure was through the roof, my blood pressure rather. So there were a whole bunch of elements which were not healthy as a result of that. I didn't take leave for many years, or proper leave. I'd always be working when I was on leave. And I had no personal boundaries, in that if someone wanted to get hold of me at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I was there. And that's a client or one of the people I was working with. So through that period, we've really helped the way, we've positioned our culture within the business around being people first.
Do you think there's periods where that's appropriate, where it's all in and, 80-hour weeks, and then you need to adjust it later? Or, do you think it's possible to build a business from the beginning with those boundaries in place?
It's a good question. To build a business from the beginning, probably not. That's part of the entrepreneur's journey. Is you got to, if you want to succeed, it's not a 9 to 5. There's a corporate job that'll pay you just as well for that. But if you want to succeed, you've got to go all in. What I would change, aside from that, is actually knowing when to step back. You should be in a position where the business can operate for at least a week or 2 weeks without you once a year, where you can just completely withdraw. So to answer your question, I don't think as an entrepreneur it's possible not to go through that, but managing it more persistently rather than just sort of running in red as I was for many, many years, having time to step away, a proper step away, is what I would change.
Yeah, look, it's such a difficult dynamic to balance, because you are the person at the front, and so all these people you're hiring and making promises to. You at least didn't have big investors to also meet their demands. It's very hard to throttle back, because even once it starts getting successful, it starts building up. It's not like the pressure really releases. In many ways, it becomes just more. Now you have more customers. Now you got more big customers. Now you've landed this huge customer. Now they've got demands, and you can't. You've celebrated the win, but now you've got to implement and hire the people for it and make sure this is happening. And then there's quality problems. And I do think that's one of the hardest things for founders and company builders, is when is the appropriate time to give away delegate some of the responsibility, hire the right person for a role, even when I don't know, like, do we have enough really money for it? But I need to, as a leader, create that capacity so that I can actually run this business. So I just want one thing I want to say, like, I always find you to be incredibly humble, but very articulate and very erudite around these issues. But I think it starts off with that humility to say, I'm not going to necessarily be the best at everything, and I can't do everything, and otherwise I am going to explode. So you obviously have that level of humility and self-reflection. So maybe I just want to switch to, like, what does the future look like? Because you guys have managed to, you've done a great thing splitting the business out for a product side and this consulting business, and you've managed to get funding. And from a many entrepreneurs' perspectives, you've kind of made it in the sense that now you're not about to die in the next 6 months or year. The business has got a fairly secure future. So what's the ambition now? How do you shift? Are you going to become much more focused on, like, do you want to build a big organization or do you want to build new stuff? Like, what's the future look like for you?
Yeah, so that's exactly. So we split the business. DealX is our product business, and we have a great strategic investor, a company called Morningstar, who is, when we're looking to go to market, because we realized, if I sort of rewind to 2019, 2017, we were starting to scale quite rapidly. And then in 2019, is if product's going to have a go, it can't just be using the cash from consulting. It's got to wash its own face, but it needs a chunk of capital so that we can hire the right amount of people and get it done. But that investor also needs to be strategic. So it's not just capital. It is someone who knows our space really well, is in the US because that's where we're focused, and is a strategic partner. So getting that right and getting the messaging right and what the motivation for why we're doing it was really important. And I think we did okay at that. Separate other businesses. Product can now be very focused on one thing, and consulting we've never really given it a mandate to grow, could now actually grow and go after, to have its own identity, rather than being the sort of mix mash of services in the same space, but not necessarily aligned. So that separation, which is then supported by our enablement function, which is like a shared service of people, accounting, IT ops, that sort of stuff, has really helped with the identity. Although we still have a reasonably common culture, we have very distinct identities as to what the two businesses are. So in terms of where we go forward with those, excuse me, from DealX, it's absolutely get not only deeper into we're currently focused on the commercial mortgage-backed securities, so CMBS, but also wider into other asset classes and other services that support that with Morningstar, our strategic investor. So really grow out our product range to service what is a niche but very rich space and structured products in the US. And then from consulting, it's really we're focusing on a single space. It's a credit and CRE, credit being not commercial lending, consumer lending, but the credit space, which includes derivatives and a bunch of other financial instruments, which are captured in that, but there's no point diving into those, is to grow our customer base and really help customers in that space solve technical problems.
So maybe just to finish, I think it's important to recognize your words about South Africa being a great place to actually build and run a business, but the market being too small. I think that's a common mm-hmm. problem. So entrepreneurs who in the region, let's say, in Africa, just generally, I think, need to be a little bit more bold about going for a global market, not only thinking about local markets, local problems, but you got to figure out a way how to find those problems globally. So, we'll just thank you for that and wish you all the best for the next phases. We'll continue to watch with a lot of anticipation.
Thanks, Dom, and thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to watching your progress as you the Tex and Sapphire as you and find your path.
Well, thanks so much to Llewellyn. I really enjoyed that. I have so much appreciation for what he does and for the mentorship that he's given me as a founder. I hope that's been of value to you. These are where you can find us on the social media platforms. You can give us some feedback there. And we also really appreciate if you would nominate others who you think should be Silicon Springboks. Thank you so much for listening to us today, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.